Oh, there he is. He's walking out. Wait a second. Is Chuck here? I think he just walked out. Okay. Well, yeah, you're moderated. You're moderating from here. Okay. Here is the. If you could just pass this on to each of the speakers that has a PowerPoint presentation and check that. So I want to introduce our moderator for this event, moderator Karen Foster. She is also a friend, and it's wonderful to see you here again at our conference, Karen. Karen Foster is an associate professor of sociology and an associate dean, glutton for punishment, of research, arts, and social sciences at Dalhousie University, and holds the Canada Research Chair in Sustainable Rural Futures for Atlantic Canada. She teaches and does does research on work, employment, economy, with interest in such subjects as the work ethic, unpaid work, and rural business succession. She was one of the founding members of Basic Income Nova Scotia. So welcome, Karen, and thank you so much for moderating this next event.
Thank you so much, Mandy. It's really nice to see some familiar faces. I haven't been closely involved in the Basic Income Nova Scotia for a while, but it's nice to see people that I used to work closely with. So it's my job to introduce our panelists and keep things moving along. So first we have Charles Plante. He's a research scientist with the Saskatchewan Health Authority and an adjunct professor at the University of Saskatchewan. For over a decade, he's led and supported efforts to quantify the cost of poverty throughout Canada. He's co-authored several reports on the topic, including The Cost of Poverty in the Atlantic Provinces in 2021 with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Most recently, Chuck has been involved in efforts to quantify the social return on investment of basic income with the Community University Institute for Social Research at the University of Saskatchewan and Coalition Canada. I'm just going to introduce everyone before the panel starts. Next, we have Sheila Regehr. She's a founding member and current chair of the Basic Income Canada Network and former executive director of the National Council of Welfare. Her 29 years of federal public service spanned frontline work, policy analysis and development, and international relations and senior management, with a focus on improving fairness and equality and on gender and race in particular. She has expertise in areas of income security and taxation, such as child tax benefits, child support, pensions, and social assistance. Her insight also comes from experiencing poverty as a young parent. Next is Liam Wilkinson. He acts as a strategist for UBI Works and has led many of its research initiatives and publications. With an academic background in international development and a professional background in public relations, he launched CEOs for Basic Income and UBI Works alongside their founder, Floyd Marinescu, who I think we had at the first Basic Income conference, maybe the second. He now serves as managing editor for the group, collaborating with other storytellers to envision a more just and prosperous future. Next, we have Rob Fennell. Rob is a professor of theology and history at the Atlantic School of Theology and an ordained minister of the United Church of Canada. His commitments to social justice run deep and are a strong part of his family heritage going back several generations. His vision for a just society combines the utopian and the pragmatic. And finally, we have Lars Osberg, who's the McCullough Professor of Economics at Dalhousie University. His visiting positions have included research on poverty alleviation, the Indira Gandhi Institute for Development Research, and the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. His most recent book, The Age of Increasing Inequality, The Astonishing Rise of Canada's 1%, won the Purvis Memorial Prize in 2019 for its contribution to Canadian economic policy. His current research emphasizes the measurement of economic well-being and the implications of and interactions between increasing inequality, economic insecurity, and inequality of opportunity. So I'm just going to ask each panelist to speak for 10 minutes on the topic that they've prepared to speak on, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Thanks everyone for coming, and thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure and honor to get to join you here in Halifax. I'm all the way from Saskatchewan. So yeah, as Karen said, I'm a research scientist and an academic who's done a lot of work to calculate the costs of poverty in Saskatchewan and throughout the rest of Canada, actually. Since I've only got 10 minutes, I'm just going to kind of jump into things. I have two different screens with different slides. I have to kind of go back and forth to keep myself on track and in the right place. So I want to start by just zooming out. Why do we care so much about poverty? I don't need to explain to anybody in this room, but poverty is unjust. I think that if you're here, this is probably something that's a real source of motivation for a lot of us. Poverty injures people. We don't think violence is okay in our society. It prevents people from achieving their full potential. But poverty is also really expensive, and I think sometimes we neglect this. And it's expensive for the same reasons that it's unjust. It injures people and it prevents people from achieving their full potential. It makes an uneven playing field. It makes it so that things aren't fair. One of my friends and collaborators, Ryan Miley, who's an advocate and leader in Saskatchewan, really likes to say this. Sometimes the right thing to do can also be the smart thing to do. And the fact that something is the smart thing to do does not diminish its rightness, or that it is also the right thing to do. And I think it's something that sometimes when we fail to make that economic case, maybe we don't need to move anybody in this room, but we're leaving arguments on the table. There are folks that could be moved by those arguments, and that's been my experience in this area. Some of the questions that I don't think we spend enough time thinking about in the anti-poverty space is questions like, what if we don't just need charity to solve all the poverty? It doesn't just have to be out of the good graces of our hearts. How much poverty could we solve at no net cost to our community? How much would our community gain by solving poverty for some? And then could this amount offset the cost of solving it for others, that maybe there isn't like an economic incentive? I saw this firsthand when I started in this space, going on 10 years ago now, working in Saskatchewan, calculating the cost of poverty for that province. I'd recently moved to Saskatchewan, and the relationship, there'd been a change of government a few years earlier, and the relationship between civil society, especially the anti-poverty community, and the sitting government had really broken down. They actually just hadn't had a meeting in several years. And folks that were organizing the space were really trying to figure out how to get a foothold, how to get heard. And they looked and they saw in Alberta, especially, which is our neighbor, you know where Alberta is. Poverty costs, there had been similar reporting done there, and they saw that as an inspiration. And we were able to actually really get a groundswell of support and get conversations happening. When we redid the calculations, or when we did the calculations for ourselves in Saskatchewan, we were really able to talk to people that hadn't talked to us before and really move the ball. When we started, the folks sitting in government did not believe that poverty could exist in a rich country like Canada. They refused to use the word poverty to describe the situation in Saskatchewan. They had a much more difficult time saying that when they actually were talking to people with lived experience. And they eventually did start using poverty as a concept in government documents. I'm just realizing that I'm not, my slides aren't in sync, like I said. So this is a poverty cost campaign. So later on, I've done similar calculations for Atlantic Canada, working with Christine Saunier and others from CCPA, showing that the cost of poverty in Nova Scotia is around 4.75% of GDP, quite substantial. Overall, when we calculate the cost of poverty, it's a simple enough idea. The challenge is getting that per person cost of poverty calculation. Once we have that, we can multiply that by the number of poor people and get a rough estimate. When we do it, we consider three different categories basically three different overall categories of cost. We think about the damage that poverty causes folks and the cost of society to repair that damage to healthcare or the criminal justice system. We also consider the opportunity costs. So, folks aren't well or aren't able to fully participate. What kinds of economic losses does that cause them and society? And we also consider the intergenerational costs, the fact that we know that children who grew up in poverty are more likely to stay in poverty when they get older. I've been able to apply this method in a few other ways, most recently working with the Institute for Fiscal Studies and Democracy to assign a poverty cost number to First Nations communities in Canada. And then more recently, it was exciting to start to pull some of these concepts together and combine it with the work of some of my colleagues at the University of Saskatchewan and folks. This work was actually supported by Coalition Canada. I know some of the folks here are involved with some of this work to calculate the social return on investment to a basic income. In this report that's going to come out in the next few weeks, I think we're going to launch it in Saskatchewan toward the end of April, and I know Coalition Canada has plans too. We calculated the SROI on a basic income guarantee and calculated that it would add about $28 billion in value and cost about $25 billion. This is actually based on Sheila's numbers, so the SROI is about 13%. Just to wrap up, some of the key takeaways here. We don't actually spend very much on poverty, even though it costs us a lot. In 2017, the cost of Nova Scotia was around $2 billion, but the province spent less than half of that on community services. But the key thing I always take with me in my work, and I always try to emphasize when I talk to people, addressing poverty isn't something that we do if we're rich. It's something I think we do to become rich as a society. We need to think about it as an investment. And if we don't consider that economic case, we risk never getting around to spending it at all and making those investments at all, and we really just miss out. So thanks a lot.
Great, thank you so much, Charles. So we'll move it on to Sheila.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? It's so nice to be here again. I'm going to do the low-tech version. I am just talking, don't do slides very well. And in 10 minutes, there's so much richness in the discussion already. I want to add all kinds of things. I'm going to try to stay on track. What I've been asked to talk about is the basic income policy options document that looks like this. That is available on our website in both French and English, and I encourage everybody who hasn't seen it to take a look because there's so much more in it than I'm going to be able to talk about in 10 minutes. So I'm going to talk about what's the cost of a basic income and how to pay for it. So this guiding framework for looking at cost-benefit issues, I want to recognize Chandra Pasma, the co-author who's really the brains behind this, and also to recognize the connections and the progress we're making in this movement that sort of she started out on the non-governmental side and now has been elected to the Ontario legislature. So we've got more people in politics. So when we're talking about cost depends on design. I mean, no amount of money is worth something if you don't know what you're getting for it. And design depends on goals. Mandy earlier showed you, the principles behind a basic income. What we've done in this document is apply the principles that we can to policy goals that we can measure. So that's what we're looking at. And we are very deliberately looking beyond poverty, partly for some of the reasons that Chuck just talked about. I learned way back, it does not resonate with so many people, but insecurity does. And that insecurity is hugely growing in this country for lots and lots of reasons. And then we also wanted to look at equality. So option one that I've been asked to address, there were 3 in the report, but option 1 is the most pragmatic one, and it looks at 18 to 64-year-olds. And for those interested in youth, we did consider some of that, but we didn't model it. So the other important thing, I think, when people forget, when you're designing the basic income, we only look at sort of the benefit side and how that design works. In order for it to really work, you have to look at the how you pay for it side, not just paying for it, but how you pay for it. That's where you get the cost benefit. I want to give a little warning to some of the other things that are out there. I've seen a lot of reference to costing that the Parliamentary Budget Office has done. They do brilliant work. They were really, really supportive of us when we were developing our modeling, great relationships with them. But what they put out reflects what other people have asked them to do. And we don't always know what the motives are. Sometimes the motives for doing basic income costing is to prove that it is too expensive. There was one, however, that showed that the cost was reasonable, but there was a little glitch in there, because when you looked in more detail, you would find that you were going to get better poverty results, but the people paying for it were going to be the people who were just above the poverty line, and that's not what we want. So this is a matter of policy choice, and now I'm going to get into, just briefly, and somebody tell me when I'm running out of time, because so what policy options does is provide what we considered, this was the modeling we used was a little bit dated, so the numbers would be higher now with inflation. But our base level, if you have no other income, would be $22,000 for a single person, $31,000 and change for a couple. We decided on a benefit reduction rate of 40%. Jeff earlier had talked about, people wanting a slow or no. No is complicated, but we wanted it slower than Ontario, so that this comes into the goal of security. You don't want to take things out from under people's knees just as they're starting to get ahead. So that low reduction rate does that. It helps bump up security. There is also a bit of a wrinkle with seniors in this model. So part of our modeling also shows a boost in GST for seniors. So that's what we have. We can measure these things. Our 22,000 base amount. The results of our modeling will show us how poverty is impacted. The reduction rate shows us how security is impacted. And then the funding sources show us, as much as anything, how inequality and a push for greater equality is impacted. So our funding resources, without going into any detail, we modeled what we could within the tax transfer system because we wanted hard numbers. A lot of the work that Chuck is doing on like looking at all of these downstream costs, we know they're there, but they're kind of hard to show in, really hard numbers when you're in front of a finance minister. So we focused on things that we really could put hard numbers to. So the funding sources included all sorts of smaller benefits that are out there already. Refundable benefits like the goods and services tax credit that's just been bumped up. It's a good vehicle for delivering to people who need it. Looking at shifting non-refundable credits that tend not to benefit anybody in the lower income part of the spectrum. So we changed those. We brought in tax fairness measures, looking at some of the benefits that go almost exclusively to people with more money. We treated every dollar the same as every other, whether it's earned from employment or capital gains. The capital gains is another way in which people who have money get tax breaks that the rest of us don't. We made some other changes to corporate taxation, and we took the income, and this goes to the concern about services. We took the income portion of social assistance, but only half of the portion of administrative funds, so that the service part of social services still had funding there, but the income would go into the basic income. So we had a provincial formula for that. So that's basically what we did. We acknowledge very clearly that this is not the only way to fund a basic income. We wanted to show that there are ways to do it, lots of ways, and these are good, fair ones. So just very quickly, I'll just highlight some of the key results. In terms of people on social assistance who would be in the first tier of income, their disposable income increased 436%. So there's like the key group that's left out of income security now. In terms of overall poverty reduction, it ended up to be a 92.6% drop. Inequality was reduced, so greater equality, by 12 to 20%, depending on family type. And the payments, everybody up into the 6th decile did manage to get a little bit of something. So we don't start, as some of the other modeling is done, we don't start pulling back and asking people to pay more until you're actually really secure. So you know that there's something there for you. The program doesn't immediately cut off too quickly. And my very last comment is to credit some work that some of my colleagues, I've been part of, but amazing colleagues in the Northwest Territories have done, looking at modeling that we couldn't do because it's really difficult in the Statistics Canada system that we use to get data for some populations, especially Indigenous populations and northern areas. And so we've just finished up a project for Alternatives North with money from the government of the Northwest Territories, looking at some of the key modeling issues that are really important for them around Indigenous issues and around the very, very high cost of living in the North. So that report will be coming out soon, and that's all for me. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sheila.
Thank you, everyone. All right, so how to pay for basic income. This is, of course, the #1 question that people have about basic income. We have found in our years of advocacy, both with the voting public, with government, with politicians, even before what exactly the basic income is going to look like, how are you going to pay for it, seems to be the #1 question. Often when we hear and advocate with politicians, that question is slightly different, is how do I sell a basic income? And so it's important to note that there are two parallel considerations that are hidden in this question. The first is what is the best policy? And the second is what is the best politics? And we have to realize that the optimization probably lies somewhere in between those questions. So we saw earlier on the petition that Mandy showed that it ended with that the politician's quote was, "This is the realm of the possible." So that's a much parroted quote by Bismarck that politics is the art of the possible, the attainable of the next best. So unlike my fellow presenters represent UBI Works today, we are neither academics, nor bureaucrats, nor policy wonks. We fancy ourselves marketers. How do we market basic income to a larger segment of the population that has previously been hostile to it? And so our plan that I'm going to present today reflects that. So one of the other things to note is that the question is much broader than merely the fiscal consideration on its face. It hides what I have identified as two key ideological objections. This first is this idea of zero-sum utility. If you take $1 from me and give it to someone else, then the net effect is null. And the second is that the perennial challenge that we've all faced having been in this movement, which is this concept of deservability, the undeserving poor, it really manifests in this question. So I have some unfortunate news. We're in a critical moment when it comes to basic income support. Polling for basic income showed since the pandemic a decline in support for basic income. So while a majority of Canadians still do support basic income, polls show consistently that most are completely unwilling to pay more taxes in order to help fund it. So this question is arguably more important than ever. And if we don't get this right, personally, I think basic income is dead in the water. And my word of caution to the movement is that we will not just be judged based on the reality of our proposals, but also how they are perceived. This tweet here references two sources. Neither of them justify the claim being made, but this claim persists regardless. So however we or an eventual government sells a basic income proposal, we should also note that it's going to take place amidst a coordinated misinformation campaign. This misinformation campaign is present, it's coordinated, it's funded today, and the gist of it is that working people are going to pay for a basic income. So This is at UBI Works. This proposal is our third such kick at the can when it comes to funding a basic income. And I think we're often inclined to think basic income can make so much sense. It's more just, it's more efficient. How could any government, how could anyone not do this? And this exercise this time around, as we really tried to drill down on this plan, was that basic income is just like any other policy. It's a matter of trade-offs, and thereby it's an extension of values. And these values are often subjective. So we have to ask the question, for instance, where does a dollar do the most good? If you have a basic income of $20,000, you could raise that to $20,003 and give a person who has no earned income an extra $3, or you could lower the clawback rate, and you could give 3 additional families each $1 each who are bringing in $40,000. Where does that dollar do the most good? And as has been referenced multiple times and by Sheila, we know that socialist programs of all sorts that reach higher into the middle class have a lot easier political road ahead of them. They have a great deal more political acceptance. But of course, that comes with reducing the efficacy and the available funds to those poorest, who ideally we're helping first and foremost. So these are all subjective trade-offs to a certain extent, and the plan which I'll now present reflects somewhat of our thinking at UBI Works, what we believe is politically feasible. Of course, that's entirely subjective, and what was feasible before the pandemic is no longer feasible now. The same could be said with inflation, and who knows what the economic conditions of tomorrow will bring. So what basic income are we talking about in this model? We use the Ontario Basic Income Pilot Model. If you've seen it, this is the one that's been costed by the PBO multiple times. The reason we chose it, it has a high degree of data and third-party analysis available for it. It is certainly not the ideal basic income model, but it is the benchmark. It is absolutely the most cited in Parliament and the most cited by politicians, and it has the added benefit of being compatible with some previous research. So I'll note quickly the limitations of this one. It's only 75% of the low-income measure, completely inadequate. It perpetuates the individual versus couple thing, which if you've been paying attention to politics in Quebec for the past couple of years, this question is actually getting increased attention from social justice organizations. They have a campaign called Le Droit à l'Amour, the idea that people should not be penalized for being in love. The clawback is at 50% in this. There is no evidence to suggest that this is the ideal optimization, 50% between the program size and the incentive structures. Completely disregards the cost of poverty and both the immediate, direct, and long-term benefits. It doesn't take into account any of the economic impacts. So the economic multipliers from lower income individuals, high propensity to spend, labor impacts being young families reducing their working hours, or people being able to negotiate higher wages. It doesn't take into account government revenue. We know, for instance, that with the Canada Child Benefit, at the end of the day, about 50 cents of every dollar dispersed on the Canada Child Benefit ends up back in provincial or federal coffers, either through sales or income tax. So the punchline for this plan is it's a net cost of $51 billion. A word of caution is this plan has also been previously costed by the PBO at a much lower amount. And that amount, they very quietly published a retraction to this. It was based on, when they looked at all the programs they were going to roll in, it was based on completely getting rid of them instead of just getting rid of them for people who would otherwise qualify for this basic income. So that difference was about $30 billion. So now that we've selected a plan, this is an exercise that myself, Sheila, or anyone else who's put out a plan goes through. You have to decide what trade-off, what are you going to optimize for? So previously we've proposed a much more expanded basic income whose gross cost was in the neighborhood of $130 billion. And we had this brilliant idea is, given all the people who are against basic income, we're going to put out 8 ways to pay for it, and something that suits everyone, no matter where you lie on the political spectrum. If you are the absolute conservative, you want to cut and burn everything. If you are a diehard environmentalist, we're going to put out a plan that works for everyone. And we thought everyone, therefore, will be able to see basic income is compatible with their other values. In reality, we found that everyone found something to hate. So it didn't work out so well. So some of the things you could optimize for, and these are the ones that in the plans that have been published to date, these are the big ones that people have previously optimized for. So the first is a low sticker price and program simplicity. You could take all of those programs, you could roll them all into one. Word of caution about this is you end up with headlines like you see above. And because a lot of these programs, even though on paper they're for low-income people, in actuality, a lot of these programs, these tax credits, are actually targeted at the middle class. So you see that when you roll them back, who ends up paying is really smack dab in the middle of the income distribution. You could, of course, also optimize for economic efficiency and minimal changes. Okay, there's a lot of change. There's a lot of programs out there that are beloved, and you don't want to have a political fight to repeal every single one of them. So what you could do is just simply raise the GST. Economists will say that's one of the least distortionary measures you could take, and it's kind of seen as fair. It's a consumption tax. But of course, it's incredibly regressive, and you're going to significantly erode the benefit that a basic income will do. So with any tax changes, we have to look, what is the net impact going to be? It's not just the gross impact of the good that a basic income will do. What is the net benefit once you take into account the funding considerations? And of course, you're going to have a very hard time getting a Canadian politician to get up and say that she wants to triple the HST. Finally, you could optimize for progressivity and capacity to pay. Okay, we know that the economic benefits of a basic income are maximized when those households that have the greatest capacity to pay are the ones who bear the cost. So with this option, you could eliminate the basic personal amount, you could raise income taxes. Word of caution here, most Canadians have no idea. When we talk about income distributions, most Canadians have absolutely no idea where they fall in this. As a way of example, we were giving a briefing to some politicians, and we said, you might have seen some other plans out there, some basic income costings, and they were a net benefit to the bottom 60% of Canadians, and they asked the top 40% to pay a little more. Ours does one better. Ours is the bottom 80% of Canadians are going to be better off, and the top 20% pay a little bit more. You saw a politician go, oh yeah, I could sell that. We said, out of curiosity, what's that number though? Oh, no, so any Canadian making over $68,000 is going to pay more tax. Silence. Right? You know what was going through the head. That's me, my family, my staff, and 95% of my donors. So we chose to optimize for three things. These three things which we saw as addressing the niche, the missing part of the basic income discussion as we saw it, a reaction to the criticisms that we were getting. We wanted to show that it could be compatible with that. So those three criteria were, it doesn't impact the vast majority of Canadians. The goal we set ourselves is to not materially impact the bottom 91%. Most of the tax measures we talk about, it's the bottom 97. Does not encourage or discourage entrepreneurship or private capital investment. It's not going to hurt the economy. The idea there is we don't want to artificially harm the economy while at the same time providing benefit. We don't want to erode wages. And finally, that it's feasible. This is probably the most subjective. It's again, a lot of value judgment here. But does it work within the existing tax code, as Sheila said? Is it easily modelable? Has it been done in other jurisdictions? Does it work? So we assessed about a couple hundred different tax policy changes. We took those from Sheila's work. We took those from political party platforms, from Canadians for Tax Fairness, from the CCPA, and we evaluated them all on an expanded 5 criteria. We got to a short list, and we had these independently analyzed by an economics research firm, and we asked them to examine the literature, write us a report for each of these tax measures, and assess them based on who is going to end up paying for it, who is going to end up bearing the cost, what impact was it going to have on investment, the business environment as a whole, and is it feasible? Where has it been done, and what are the impacts have been there? So from that, we got to 3 broad categories of tax measures. And each of the ones that you'll see shortly has a detailed write-up and why, and they're often slightly tweaked from the standard version that's presented. So you can feel free to explore that on our website. The first is increased contributions from the financial sector, who are an incredibly tax privileged business sector. The second is fewer tax breaks for large companies, taking away some of the incredibly bloated parts of the tax code that benefit many of our largest companies disproportionately. And finally, fewer subsidies for the wealthiest. You'll see here some ideas that you might have seen before, but there's some specific tweaks here. We're not going to take away the basic personal amount for everyone. We're going to start it at the 4th tax bracket and slowly do it up. This is in line with recent changes to make the basic personal amount a little more progressive, and to convert the RSP tax deduction into a refundable tax credit. So that it is not almost 90% of the cost foregone taxes for the RSP tax credit comes from the top 10% of Canadians. So we're going to slightly tweak how that is delivered. So at the end of the day, this allows us to answer this one core problem. And when we see all this on social media, when we see all this misinformation, we can answer the question, who pays? Probably not you. If your money doesn't come from passive income investments, if your money's not coming from stock options, if your money comes from a paycheck, you're probably not going to pay for this. And the punchline being that we can fund a national basic income without taxing most working Canadians. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Liam. Next up, Rob.
One year and 5 months ago to the day at 8:15 p.m., I was being driven with great haste by a friend to the Cobequid Health Center in Lower Sackville because we thought I was having a heart attack. The emergency room was busy that night, not overwhelmed, thank goodness. The staff at that moment in the pandemic were being appropriately cautious about the infectious nature of the virus. My friend was calm and smiling, and I was absolutely losing my mind because I thought I was going to die. 2.5 years earlier, a close relative of mine had been rushed to emergency in another city because his aorta had ruptured, and he had a very short time to live if emergency surgery was not immediately available to him. And with enough genetic similarity to my relative, I was sure that I was in the same situation with a very short time to live. And if you or someone you know has been in a similar moment, you know already that words are far from adequate to explain or express that feeling, standing on the razor's edge between life and death. As you might have guessed by now, I did not die that night in the Cobequid Health Center, and so far I have not died since. And I'm happy to tell you that my relative is still with us on this side of the sod. All of this is due to the extraordinary skill of medical professionals, amazing medical research, the grace of God, and your tax dollars. I'm alive because of your tax dollars. I hope that doesn't cause too much instant regret. When universal Medicare was introduced to this country, the charge was led by Tommy Douglas, a Baptist preacher who became a politician. He was Premier of Saskatchewan, later a member of Parliament, later still the first leader of the New Democratic Party. He stared into the jaws of the lion. He fought off dissent and ridicule. He championed the cause of universal Medicare throughout the doctors' strike. He traded barbs with the opposition. And he finally joined forces with that redoubtable progressive conservative, John Diefenbaker, and liberal Lester Pearson to make a national system of Medicare a reality. These three politicians and their respective caucuses fought tooth and nail to make sure that your tax dollars would keep me alive. 60 years later, I'm alive because of Tommy Douglas and your tax dollars. Well, I'm not supposed to be talking about universal Medicare, but I do want to make a point about it that is vitally and urgently significant to our theme here today. Universal Medicare came about because people fought for it. It came about because of the ordinary citizens of this country who persuaded their elected officials that they wanted their tax dollars to go to work for the common good. They wanted their tax dollars to go for the common good. No one had ever even thought of me in the early 1960s. No one foresaw me being rushed into the Cobequid Health Center in Lower Sackville. No one imagined the medical testing and procedures that I would require, but together, the ordinary citizens of this country decided through a groundswell of popular support that their tax dollars were well spent if they wanted to keep each other in good health. I think we're on the precipice of another such a moment. The Basic Income Conference and the basic income groups and friends and all of us who have come together are part of a nationwide movement that is saying we want our neighbors, not only ourselves, to have dignity, to have decent shelter, to have enough food for their kids and for themselves. And we are willing to spend our tax dollars to make that happen. We are willing to share. It is a priority for us because that's the kind of society we want. My topic is fair taxation. And I think the vast majority of people in this country would willingly agree, if asked, without much persuasion, that taxes should be fair. And indeed, the taxation regimes in this country aspire towards fairness. But we have also been seduced by the siren songs of slogans of political parties who promise things like tax cuts. Who doesn't want a tax cut? Yay, tax cuts. We have started to believe in this society, in this era of late capitalism and the ascendancy of neoliberalism, that tax cuts are an expression of some kind of social righteousness. We have been told over and over that we should want tax cuts. Tommy Douglas of Medicare fame wanted people to have a fair deal too, starting with access to medical care. That for him was a form of fair taxation or social righteousness that he would like to see. But a great many people in this country and in the modern West in general think that taxation is a great evil. One of my Twitter conversation partners last month rather pointedly and pithily replied to my remarks with 3 words. He said, "Taxation is theft." So I want to propose to you today that tax fairness and tax cuts and taxation is theft are all phrases that love to be bandied about as synonyms, but they are in fact deeply contradictory. Tax cuts are not an expression of fair taxation. Tax cuts are not an expression of fair taxation if it means my neighbor cannot feed her child supper, and that child goes to school hungry in the morning because they are literally too impoverished to have a place to live and have enough to eat. That is not fair taxation. Trumpeting the slogan, as my Twitter interlocutor said, trumpeting the slogan that taxation is theft is not an expression of tax fairness. Proposing that taxation is theft is a form of intentional ignorance. If we step back enough to consider rationally the massive public good that arises from combining our resources. Taxation provides for roads and schools and fire services and public health and disaster relief and sanitation, and for the emergency room and the personnel at the Cobequid Medical Center. Call me a fool on April Fool's Day if you like, but I like taxation. I like paying my taxes. Do I want more money in my pocket? Sure I do, because I'm a little selfish and a little greedy. Of course I want more for myself. Maybe that's human nature, but we don't have to be trapped by our selfishness. We don't have to be trapped by our greed and short-sightedness. We can rise above that as a society and say, there is another way. There is another option. Tommy Douglas and his crew knew it 60 years ago when they fought for universal medical care, and we know it today as we fight for basic income. Basic income, as we have heard already today, reduces some of the other costs to the public purse. Contact with the justice system, homelessness, violence, addictions, recidivism, domestic abuse, petty crime, and serious crime. Basic income reduces the costs of our overburdened systems of welfare and police services and healthcare. Basic income reduces the costs of all the structures and buildings and vehicles and offices and personnel required to keep those systems in place. In short, poverty is more expensive than reducing poverty. Poverty is more expensive than reducing poverty. More government services is more expensive than fewer government services. Anyone who argues otherwise is either lacking in creativity or too lazy to do the math. There is another way. It is the way of dignity. It is the way of decency and common sense and the moral high ground and respect and mutual trust. It is the way of putting into action, real action, our half-hearted utterances about wanting fair taxation and a just society. I'm alive because of your tax dollars. And I'll tell you more than that, I am grateful for your tax dollars. And even more than that, I want my tax dollars to help keep someone else alive, to help them really live, to have enough to be able to feed their child supper and send them to school properly fed and with proper snow pants and with running shoes and enough money for a comic book and some chewing gum and a childhood. I want my tax dollars hard at work, lifting people out of poverty, not keeping them down in some kind of spinning whirlpool of a welfare system that dehumanizes and cannot hope to alleviate suffering in a lasting way. I happen to be someone who follows Jesus, and not just on Twitter. And the most important thing that Jesus said is that he came into this world so that all would have abundant life. Abundant life, not scraping by, not just barely making it, abundant life. And I want abundant life for everyone in this city and in this province and in this country. You can keep my tax cuts. Thank you very much.
Amen. All right, next we have Dr. Lars Osberg. You gonna come up here?
Okay, it is live here. And do we have something where there's a pointer? Yes, there is a pointer. That's great. I'm going to talk about historical context a bit, because the idea of a basic income guarantee is not exactly a new one. Some of the biggest experiments and the most visibility of the idea of a basic income guarantee started in the 1970s, when the basic income experiments were oriented. And it was actually featured in the 1972 presidential election in the United States. George McGovern, the Democratic candidate, had mentioned during the primaries the idea of a basic income guarantee. This is like heckling or something. So, George McGovern, who was running against Richard Nixon, had mentioned during the Democratic primaries the idea of a basic income guarantee at $1,000 a month. And in the US, and didn't mention it after that, but I happened to be a grad student in the States at the time in New Haven, and on polling day, that mention by George McGovern of the idea of a basic income guarantee was one of the two things that the Republicans wanted to remind voters of in the little pamphlet they handed to voters as they went to the polling booth. And it wasn't a big winner for George McGovern. He won the state of Massachusetts and Washington, D.C., and every other state in the continental United States and Hawaii and Alaska voted for Richard Nixon. So I think we really want to think a little bit about what's different now in the political context and the economic context that might make a basic income guarantee something more than an electoral suicide note. So one of the things that was still going on, well, go over on this side. One of the things that was still going on back in the 1970s was there was still a long period of increase in average hourly wages. The 1970s are just in right here. Historically, Canada and the United States both had increasing average hourly wages for ordinary workers. And you could say that economic inequality was the price we paid for increasing average living standards. But after 1980, average hourly wages stagnated in both Canada and the United States. After 1980, the benefits of growth are really very much at the very top of the income distribution and hardly at all at the bottom and in the middle of the income distribution. In fact, if we look at the increase from 1982 to 2018 in average wages with average income and capital gains within the top 1%, it really understates the issue because it's really the top 1/10 of 1% and the top half of 1% whose incomes have really gone up. It's just that you can't get them on the same graph because they measure their incomes in millions rather than in just a few hundred thousands. So one of the things that it's different about context is that we've seen the last 40 years where the gains from growth have gone to the top of the income distribution. And that's part of a big swing in many countries where the top 1% share was really high in the 20s, fell during the Second World War, kind of flatlined through the 60s and the 70s. And then since the 1980s began, there's been a massive increase in the share of the top 1% in national income, coinciding with a long-term downward trend in the share of national income that goes to labor. So we're in a different world, and have been for the last 40 years, than what was going on in the States. And of course, most especially, along came COVID. And for the last 3 years, we've been our lives have been dominated by COVID. And it was just a massive shock on many levels to all our social institutions, interacting in its uncertainties, a massive shock to inequality and insecurity and in uncertainty about the future. Now, I think there are some really immediate and powerful lessons from COVID, and one of which is right off the top. We actually need social safety nets. The neoliberal agenda was talking all about how the market could take care of things, and it was absolutely clear from the get-go that the market did not and cannot deliver economic security. And for like a couple of decades, everybody in Canada was being told that social change and policy change, it's really slow and it takes a long time and a lot of things have to be considered and you can't do it because it might increase the deficit. Well, hey, we had the CERB within a matter of weeks. Multi-billion-dollar social programs were delivered by the government of Canada within a matter of weeks. It was an achievement of our Canadian civil service to actually do that. And it showed what governments can do when there's a real emergency. And it also showed very clearly that the sky didn't actually fall when government deficits went through the roof, partly because most of those increases in government debt were bought by the Bank of Canada, which is basically it's owed, we owe it to ourselves through the Bank of Canada. And when we think about the impact of COVID, well, it's a relatively, 3 years is a relatively small fraction actually of my experienced life, but it's a very large fraction of the conscious life of anybody under 25. It's dominated the world of the younger cohorts. It's a formative experience of an entire generation. So, and we have also a bunch of polling evidence that indicates that the attitudes and the beliefs of the millennial generation, who also saw the 2008 financial crisis and have experienced the world of gigs and of increasing inequality and are really concerned about the climate crisis in a way that previous generations weren't really conscious of at the same age. There are big generational differences in political attitudes, and this is the formative experience of a generation. So I think there's a big issue is up for grabs as to what sort of policy paradigm will inform the post-COVID world, which we are kind of entering as we speak. And here I'm going to skip over a lot of this slide because it's got too many words in it. But I did want to point out that there was the Keynesian consensus, which informed social and economic policy right up until about 1980, was really based on the idea that what we should organize our society to maintain social and political stability, because the people who were at the center of economic and social power at that time were the people who had also seen what the Depression of the 1930s had produced and the costs of the wars and the Holocaust that came out of the 1930s. So it was the idea of building a society where people thought that things were basically fair, where growth was broadly shared, where there was a taste of economic security for everybody. That was central to their vision of the world. But the problem is that if you do that for like a generation, then people start to take it for granted. So along came the neoliberal agenda, where the social and political stability were an assumption, not an objective. And you kind of forgot for 30 or 5 or 40 years how important it is to have a sense of economic security for everybody and a fair sharing of the benefits of growth. And guess what? When you put it all to the market, what do? You get increasing top-end shares, income stagnation for the rest of society, and increased economic insecurity all around. And so I think there's a big question that we're going to have to solve in Canada fairly soon, is what's our vision of the future that we're going to have coming out of COVID? Are we going to go back to what I call zombie neoliberalism? Because actually one of the big things in neoliberalism was always globalization, and we don't do globalization anymore, we do friendshoring. One of the big things in the neoliberal agenda was balancing budgets, and we don't do that anymore. We have stable GDP debt to GDP ratio. So a lot of the heart of neoliberalism isn't there anymore, but it's still sort of, the zombies don't need hearts, they just stagger on, right? But it's still influential. And the basic reason, I think, is because Canada's top end did really well, has done really well for like the best part of 35, 40 years. And they kind of gotten used to that idea, low taxes and rising incomes at the top of the income distribution. It's not a large fraction of the population that really digs that, but it's a very influential fraction of the population. So we have a problem that, And one of the things that comes out of a lot of international comparison is that after pandemics, you often see a whole period of social conflict because we've had a sort of a pressure cooker experience and a lot of stresses build up, and those impacts on social conflict are highest in places with the less of a social safety net. So if we think of what's, are we going to go back to the same old emphasis on economic growth, which hasn't actually benefited people in the middle of the income distribution all that much, and isn't likely to over the next few years. Well, there is a dark scenario out there. We have a whole bunch of examples around of the authoritarian nationalist quote unquote solution, which is all about scapegoating and telling people stories about who the authors of misfortune are and where our glorious mythical past can be resurrected. And it involves ignoring the real problems of increasing poverty and economic inequality and economic insecurity. And if those problems aren't actually addressed, then they kind of fester and get worse over time. So you kind of have to go more and more down that rabbit hole if you don't address the real problems. So that's why I think that a basic income guarantee is kind of important. And in part, it's important because it's all about economic security. And I was very glad to hear Sheila talk about economic security and to emphasize that and to emphasize the importance of a basic income guarantee as a benefit for everyone. Because I think there's a bit of a problem when we frame a basic income guarantee as always being about reducing poverty. Because that can set up the idea of, well, it's not me, it's them that this whole thing is benefiting. And I was really glad to hear Rob talk about his heart attack, because we already, because we have in Canada a basic heart attack guarantee. And his surgery didn't just benefit him. I didn't have a heart attack, but I did benefit from the knowledge that if I did have it, I would get taken care of. So there's an insurance value, my knowledge that that I don't have to worry about that is an important part of my well-being. And if I look around this room, you're all benefiting from that knowledge too. Your probability of a heart attack is kind of different if I just take a guess, but you're all benefiting to some degree from the knowledge that that is available for you. And similarly, a basic income guarantee is an important form of economic security for everyone. It's not your taxes that are financing it. It's our taxes that are financing it. And so this idea that we all benefit if we insure each other's well-being, if we take some worries off the table for everyone, I think that's a more fruitful way of thinking about a basic income guarantee. Now, it's absolutely true that it also produces less poverty, and that has a whole bunch of side benefits in terms of healthcare and crime and all those other things, and that's an important part of the issue. But greater economic security for everyone, less poverty and less inequality are really what a basic income guarantee can generate. And I think it's important for our vision of the future, and in particular for avoiding what I would call a dark vision of our possible future. So thanks very much.
Okay, thank you so much to our 5 panelists. I have some questions, but I'm also cognizant that the audience hasn't had a chance to ask questions yet. So I thought I would turn it over to you folks and see if anyone has questions for the panel. You might have a question that you just want any of them to answer, or something for a specific speaker. Be show of hands, I can bring the microphone around. So did everyone hear that? Where do we fit the disability benefit in the context of a basic income?
I will go for it. We've actually been working many people in the basic income movement have been working quite closely with people in the disability movement. And they are very supportive of a basic income for everybody, and they see the disability benefit, I think, as like one more way of getting forward to give people the security they need. One of the risks there, though, is that you then some people are able to reinforce the idea of deservedness. And so that those with disabilities who are seen as deserving are now going to get a disability benefit, and that portion of the population that's a bit smaller now, that still doesn't have access to a basic income, is further demonized and makes it even harder to get that. So there's pros and cons to these things. It'll be really interesting to see what comes out in the detail, because the framework legislation is really vague. A lot is up to the recommendation or the regulations. So, we very strongly support a basic income that's at a level that allows everybody to meet basic needs. And then disability is added onto that based on actual disability concerns. Some people may have invisible disabilities. People talked about brain injury. And you see like a lot of neurodiversity lately too. Like people have different ways of being able to cope with the world and meet their employment and income needs. For some people, the basic income might be enough. As we saw in the Ontario pilot, lots of people reduced medication, their depression, anxiety, lots of things that can lead to disabling conditions. Those things improved. For others, physical and mental accommodations are really, really quite expensive. That obviously is not going to be covered by anybody's basic income. And that's really, really important for people with disabilities, I think.
Yeah, I'll add to that. I'm unaware of any major plans that have been proposed that don't include a disability top-up, or any legislation that doesn't include that extenuating need, circumstance, and requirements are not also going to be taken into consideration. I have seen various numbers for what the top-up should be, and of course, there is a broad push to make that highly adaptive, but yes, as Sheila said, the concerns of making a basic income that can handle almost all circumstances is still a primary goal.
Okay, we have, I think, 2 questions.
Okay, so I've been learning a lot about the disability benefit because, like you said, I believe it's a gateway to push the Overton window to be like, well, if we can do that for this group, then we can do it for everybody. I think we should just skip to doing it for everyone, but politics are dumb. And I'm just wondering, because many things that people with disabilities are worried about, as am I, is the idea of clawbacks. So this is a federal benefit. So as we all know, I don't care who I alienate here, the Conservatives, and in fact, Nova Scotia politics in general, the people in power, love to claw back benefits as soon as the feds give some money. They're like, oh, I guess we don't need to do this anymore, because they have, but then it doesn't lead us out of poverty, because we're just back to where we started, just getting money from a different source. How could we prevent, like with the guaranteed basic income, how can we prevent clawback? So it's like, oh, well, you have this guaranteed basic income, so I guess you don't need, dental care and stuff, even though we don't have dental care yet, even though we have universal health care, which is a misnomer and a lie, a gross lie to the Canadian people, and the rest of the world, actually. So how do we prevent greedy politicians who want to save money at the expense of, human dignity from doing that bullshit?
Well said. Unfortunately, I don't have the more general solution to that, but I know that in every basic income conversation I've been in, there's the principle of no one should be left worse off, that in the changes to any programs, that this should only be a net additive, is a concept that I know of no one who is working for this doesn't hold and isn't hold primary in the design.
So, how do we stop people doing bullshit without doing like a French revolution? That's the only thing I can see is about Theology, but worldly, of course. So we can't do that, and what is that going to? So, how do we stop that? Other than doing the stuff. But, oh, I'll just gotta wait 4 years to go this asshole out, but it's another asshole.
I think how we approach our advocacy is that people are people, that there is no two classes of people, and politicians, in my view, certainly aren't a separate class of individuals with separate motivations. I believe. Well, I would have to disagree with you on that. I think, I mean, you've seen today, there are a lot of people who are in utter good faith working towards the betterment.
Yeah, it's really hard. One of the things that really impressed me when we had a basic income march in Toronto that these guys helped organize, and whenever there were lots of people came out, one of the women that I marched with is involved, as I am, in sort of a tripartite thing. One is basic income, one is fair taxation, and the third is fair vote. So anybody who's working on citizens' assemblies and proportional representation, fair systems, those systems are going to produce better outcomes for, so many people who are ignored in the way the current political structure works. So, I'm not a politician, but.
One thing I think is very important is to recognize the role that fatalism and cynicism plays in perpetuating inequality and perpetuating poverty. The perception that, oh, they're all scoundrels, leads quite quickly to the idea that there is no hope for change, which leads very quickly to the idea that I can't do anything, nobody can do anything, it's all got to stay the same because that's the way the world is. I think we have to start, if there's going to be meaningful change, from an idea that change is possible, and that there will necessarily be some agents of those changes. We have on this table people who are working in different ways to achieve a common objective. I don't know if anybody here is like making money off this. But we are involved in the political process. We are in this sense trying to influence politicians, who are, as I think it's absolutely correct to say, a mixed bag. Some are and some are not careerists, and most everybody has at least a few positive impulses in their personality, which you can sometimes appeal to. And so I think we want to emphasize the idea that change is possible, because if we don't believe that change is possible, it certainly won't happen.
All right, we're going to move on to a new question. Okay, and Wayne, I'll come back to you after this one.
Right, thank you a lot to everyone. I have a question that's general. Anyone can answer it, please. As we think long term and starting from now, actually, do you think that artificial intelligence and automation will have an impact on speeding up when basic income comes into place, and as it becomes more of a reality that people who are most vulnerable, working in minimum wage jobs and so on and so forth, might lose their jobs to a robot or to an automated system or so on and so forth. So, and I wonder if that was a part of the proposals made to the federal government and discussed in the parliament. Thank you.
Yeah, I can take that one as you it works.
I think it's such an interesting question about AI and automation, because we don't really know how it's going to mature. I mean, there was just a call this past week for a halt to further AI development for 6 months, so people can recalibrate its impact. I don't think there's any possible way there's going to be any kind of halt. I mean, and anytime anybody who wants to make money on something sniffs the possibility of making money, they're going to pursue it. So that's coming, and I don't think we know yet what the impact is going to be. If it does mean fewer net jobs in a given society, how do we cope with that? We already have that problem, notwithstanding the so-called labor shortage we're experiencing. But if there are fewer net jobs, how does a society respond to that? Do we say, well, maybe we want to value the work of artists, for example, or we want to value the work of persons who care for other persons differently, because goodness knows there's a lot of care that is needed? Or do we just simply resign ourselves again to saying, well, that means more unemployment and too bad and shucks? So my understanding of basic income is a guarantee of a standard of living for persons, and if they are still able to work, then that's a good thing, whereas other systems actually punish them and penalize them for working. So there may be other kinds of work that automation and AI will produce that we perhaps don't know about yet. I think it's a fascinating question, but I really feel like we're on the thin edge of the wedge on it. Otherwise, it's kind of futurism from my perspective. But I'd love to hear more from you, maybe at the break.
I'll add to that. So one of the graphs that we saw in the last presentation was the declining wages per economic output, right? So there was a decoupling of productivity and wages that happened. And AI, I think, is certainly going to accelerate this, that you will absolutely be able to produce more with less inputs, and those inputs are going to shift, as has been the trend for a long time, with less labor inputs and more capital inputs. And I'm sure that AI is going to be considered a capital input. So I agree. I don't think that the kind of doom and gloom things that we're all going to have, that it's going to get rid of all jobs, it's not something that's brand new. This has been happening to a certain degree for a long time. So when Excel came out, suddenly you didn't need 20 accountants at your firm, you needed one. The same impacts. It won't completely get rid of jobs. It'll just increase individual workers' productivity and probably shrink the overall number. The question is, how fast does that change come? So we've seen in previous big technological disruptions, be it because of the internet or because of globalization, we saw that a lot of people get left behind in the transition. So it is not a reasonable thing to expect someone who's been working on the line for 40 years of their life to suddenly be able to they get laid off and suddenly they're going to be able to retrain and enter the new exciting world of the World Wide Web. It didn't happen. Instead, we saw huge numbers of people going on disability benefits. So I think a lot of people are going to look at AI and reevaluate their own precarity, their own insecurity. It's the theme we've been talking about. It'll certainly have an impact. I'm hopeful that with some that we can navigate the overall social impacts of AI, but it's certainly going to be a major disruption. And there likely will be a lot of workers who are left in the lurch in the meantime. And I'm confident that a basic income will be certainly part of the discussion about how do we support people facing a brand new labor market.
Right, we have a question right up here. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, can I add just one thing to that? Because we've got a grad student doing some work for us, and I think I really like the phrase that you mentioned, the human edge of the wedge, because I think this combination of technology and COVID and the way we've really oriented our lives has really disrupted who we are as humans. And I think you're seeing that in mental health crises everywhere. I mean, Toronto is just nuts. I mean, people are afraid to ride the subway because there are people with mental health conditions who aren't properly housed and treated, who are now endangering other people. Students ride the subway every day to go to school, and they're really nervous about getting on. People who used to go into the office and have human experiences with lots of different people are now stuck at home working remotely and have forgotten how to work with people. Like there were really huge implications to a lot of this. So I see basic income also as a really humanizing kind of thing, because it allows us to cope and to do other things.
All right, so I'm just going to pass the mic over here.
So I will benefit from basic income if it comes into play. I will be able to give my children a better life. But I arrived today with my 6-year-old, which can be distracting, and I've been abandoned by my 14-year-old. There's video games upstairs. What is the best way to explain to my 14-year-old what basic income is so he can teach his class what it is, how it's going to be covered, in a way that's they have a lot of stereotypes in grade 8 that needs to be challenged. And what's a really good way to present this so he can talk to his teacher in his class and do a little presentation? Basically, how do we break it down so kids can understand this, in hopes that, well, some people who are more obstinate might understand it as well?
Happy to take another time, yeah.
I love it. I love it. Anybody who's ready and willing to work on that, I think it's brilliant. One of the most amazing things that was done in Brazil when the Bolsa Familia came out was something very much like that. It was just this tiny little graphic novel that Senator Eduardo Suplicy put out, that they designed because they were dealing with people with really low literacy levels and that sort of thing. So it was designed to be very basic. It's a beautiful little idea. I think the Irish did something like that at one point too.
In terms of messaging, the thing that I think we see resonates most with children and young people is this concept of choice. It's really, while children are often painfully aware of the realities of poverty and the dynamics in their classroom that money plays, I think one of the greatest ways that we have to explain it and say that there are some people, some of your classmates functionally have more choices than you. You know how at home we have to decide between going to soccer practice or baseball practice? Not every family needs to make that choice. So one of the things when, in my own personal experience, when trying to sell it to very young people or to children, is to explain it in terms of it enables everyone to have choices.
I'm a big fan of the sandwich metaphor. There might be a couple people in our classroom that didn't have a sandwich today, and we just want to make sure everybody's got a sandwich. You can do a lot with sandwiches, by the way. You probably know that. You put a lot of different things in them. You can make them with different outsides.
So it's a very versatile metaphor if you need
It's a
it for
cruel
anything.
thing to talk about right before lunch.
Isn't that a coincidence?
Yeah, that's a really great segue to the last question before sandwiches. So sorry, I know other people have, I already promised it up here. I'm sorry.
I have a simple questions. And do our Canadians have the funding for the unemployment? Is yes. Yeah. That's my question.
We can fit another one then, yeah.
Okay, perfect. So we have a question from Matthew Ritchie from the online chat here. Profit has been sold as the primary driver for why UBI hasn't already been deployed, but it's clear that if workers were well cared for, then the profit for companies would go up by a lot, as healthy, happy workers are more productive. The reality is it's never been about profit, but has always been about power. So long as there is a poor underclass disciplined by poverty to sell their labor to the owner class, UBI will never happen. What can we do about this? How can we organize against this? And what is the work already being done? It's a very big question.
I'll bite, and then I suspect Liam and Lars might have other things to add. I think sometimes we sort of reify business as one group and having one interest, and we're not sensitive enough that there probably are some businesses that can make more money if they degrade their workers, but there's lots of sectors where that's really not good for them, and we probably need to do more to explain, to actually turn the businesses against each other, so they stop seeing themselves as all oh yeah, we want lower taxes. Yeah, I don't know, Liam, if you guys worked on that at all, but.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things historically in this movement, there's been some mistrust, I think, between some of the labor sides of it and some of the activist sides directly for this. One of the great results that came out of the Basic Income Project in Manitoba was that it actually enabled people, even people who weren't receiving the basic income, saw benefits to their wages. That if you increase the bargaining power of those at the very bottom, that actually trickles up. So I think there is some concept in solidarity and in terms of building broad coalitions where that, even if you don't yourself receive a basic income, it'll probably enable you to negotiate for higher wages.
Go ahead, Lars.
The only thing I'd want to add to that, which kind of comes back a little bit to the question on artificial intelligence, is that if we think of a vision of the future, the idea that robots can make the robots that can make all the stuff we need, and artificial intelligence can replace a lot of the people who are doing kind of repetitive service sector jobs, has a job loss implication, but it also has a positive spin in that it could be that we could imagine a world where less work is required to produce what we need to live on, except that we want to think about how we would organize the distribution of purchasing power in that world. Because if we leave it all to the market, we can be pretty sure that the owners of the robots will get an income, and perhaps the programmers of the robots will get an income, but less so of an income, because the artificial intelligence people will replace some of them. So, and there will be, nannies and gardeners and butlers and stuff for the people who own the robots, but the rest of us will be kind of struggling for our income. Or we could imagine a world where there is something like a basic income guarantee, where people have choices as to whether to take a low-wage job. Some relatively low-wage jobs will continue, but they'll be filled by the people who actually enjoy being baristas because they have enough of an income from something else. And that strikes me as a better kind of world. Now, it's not a world where money does everything for you. It's not a world where the basic income guarantee replaces all of the social assistance systems, which also often involve services and commodities, which people in particular circumstances actually need. So basic income guarantee can't be thought of as a replacement for all social welfare expenditures. It's a supplement, and it's a way of dealing with this issue that, as a society, we're moving into a world of technology where, in fact, we don't need all the time, all of us to work all these hours at jobs that are repetitive, because machines can do it for us. And we can get to enjoy each other's company and, you know, make art and music and do other useful things in the rest of our time. But a basic income guarantee is a pretty important element.
One of the consistently best performing images that our graphic artist at UBI Works has ever produced is a small comic with 2 panels. On one side it says how it is, shows a robot and a man, and the man says, "Ah, a robot took my job." And on the other panel it says how it should be, and the guy goes, "Ah, a robot took my job."
Okay. Thank you so much again to our 5 panelists. We are going to speed right into lunch. And then I think the objective is to get back on schedule at 1. So that's a very short lunch, but I think you're invited to, sit, eat while you're listening to the next speakers, and we'll get things back on track. Thank you.